If you've been listening recently, you know we've talked about protein as infrastructure, an ongoing expense tied to what we expect our bodies to maintain. That framing still stands, but there's a more basic error that shows up before we even get to the accounting. After a lot of conversations about protein, peptides, muscles, and longevity, there's a pattern that keeps showing up, and that's what I want to focus on today. It's not that we're wrong, it's that we're starting in the wrong place. The most common question we ask when we want to improve our health, build muscle, or age well is some version of this: how much protein should I be eating? It sounds reasonable. It sounds informed. It sounds like we've done our homework, but it's almost always the wrong first question, because muscle recovery and long-term health are not built by starting with macronutrients. They're built by establishing hierarchy, and hierarchy matters more than details. If we zoom out and look at what is actually driving muscle preservation as we age, it is not primarily protein intake. It is mechanical tension, hormonal signaling, sleep depth, and recovery integrity. Protein is part of that system. It is not the driver of that system. We don't grow muscle while we're lifting. We grow muscle when we recover from lifting. The stimulus is mechanical stress, and the adaptation is biological repair. That repair requires sleep, adequate endocrine signaling, and sufficient substrate. Most of us jump straight to substrate. We count grams before we lift consistently. We worry about amino acid timing before we've established progressive overload. And we debate animal versus plant protein before we know whether we are sleeping deeply enough to support repair. This isn't criticism. It is, however, a sequencing problem. When we start with protein, we are optimizing a variable that only matters if the upstream variables are already in place. And if we are not lifting heavy enough to create a stimulus, additional protein does not create muscle. If we are sleeping 4 to 5 fragmented hours per night, additional protein does not create muscle. And if our endocrine system is suppressed because of chronic stress, under recovery, or poor metabolic health, additional protein does not override that biology. We can't out-supplement instability. This is where the hierarchy becomes important. At the foundation is stability. That means metabolic stability, sleep consistency, and endocrine balance. On top of that is stress, not psychological stress, but physical stress in the form of resistance training that is sufficient to challenge muscle tissue. On top of that is recovery, which includes sleep depth, nervous system regulation, and the hormonal environment that supports repair. Only after those layers are functioning does substrate optimization, protein, carbohydrate timing, and supplement selection meaningfully move the needle. If we reverse that order, we are adding complexity before we have built a foundation, and complexity layered onto instability does not produce resilience, it produces confusion. We have a cultural bias towards visible metrics. Grams of protein are visible, they are measurable, and they are easy to track and to discuss. Sleep architecture, endocrine integrity, and recovery quality are less visible. They're harder to quantify in everyday conversation, and they require patience and behavioral change rather than product selection. So we default to what we can measure easily, but ease of measurement does not equal magnitude of impact. Consider aging and muscle preservation. We know that skeletal muscle mass is one of the strongest predictors of independence later in life. We also know that strength correlates with reduced fall risk, improved metabolic health, and better overall outcomes. What builds that strength? Consistent resistant training over years, adequate recovery, hormonal signaling that allows tissue repair, and progressive overload. Protein supports that process, but it does not initiate it. And if we are sedentary and double our protein intake, our muscle mass will not meaningfully increase. If we're lifting consistently, sleeping well, and maintaining endocrine health, moderate protein intake is usually sufficient to support adaptation. The limiting factor is almost never protein in isolation. Another example is recovery signaling through growth hormone. Growth hormone is not secreted primarily during the workout. It pulses during deep sleep, and the body repairs when the nervous system is downregulated, when parasympathetic tone increases, and when restorative sleep stages are intact. If our sleep is shallow, irregular, or chronically shortened, the hormonal environment for repair is compromised. No macronutrient adjustment overrides that. Similarly, testosterone in both men and women plays a role in muscle maintenance. Chronically elevated stress, inadequate sleep, metabolic dysfunction, and excessive caloric restriction all blunt that hormonal environment. Before we ask how much protein we need, a more appropriate first question might be, are we consistently creating a meaningful mechanical stimulus? And right behind that, are we recovering from it? The body is not a static equation. It's a dynamic system that responds to stress and adapts to recovery. Muscle tissue does not grow because we feed it more building blocks. It grows because it was challenged and then allowed to repair. If we remove the challenge, nothing happens. And if we remove the repair environment, nothing happens. If both are present, however, the substrate requirement is still modest. This does not mean protein is irrelevant, of course. It means protein is contextual. In most developed environments, true protein deficiency is rare and severe deficiency states are uncommon. What is far more common are deficits in sleep quality, deficits in resistant training exposure, and deficits in fiber intake that impair gut health and metabolic function. That last piece is important. We often discuss protein as if it exists in isolation, and it does not. Diet is a system, and if we are obsessing over hitting a protein target before consuming minimal fiber, we may be supporting muscle substrate while undermining gut integrity and metabolic health. If bowel transit slows and systemic inflammation increases, that affects recovery as well. The body does not compartmentalize nutrients the way social media does. Everything interacts. We are also tempted to escalate prematurely. If muscle growth plateaus, the next step some of us consider is hormone therapy or advanced peptide protocols. But again, the hierarchy matters. If sleep is inconsistent, if resistance training is not progressive, if stress is unmanaged, adding exogenous hormones or aggressive interventions layers power onto instability. In medicine, when we stimulate the body's own production of hormones, we are often trying to restore physiology, not override it. This is a meaningful difference between enhancing what the body is designed to produce and flooding the system beyond physiologic norms. The short-term visual effects of aggressive optimization can be appealing. The long-term consequences are less visible, but far more significant. This is why the first question matters. If your first question is, how much protein should I eat? We are starting at layer 4 of a 4-layer system. If our first question is, are we lifting in a way that actually challenges the body? We're starting closer to the foundation. And if our next question is, are we sleeping in a way that allows repair? We're building the second layer. Only after those are stable does the fine-tuning of intake become impactful. There is a difference between optimization and alignment. Optimization implies squeezing performance out of a system, where alignment implies bringing that system back into proper order. Most of us need alignment before we need optimization. The visible variables will always be attractive. They are concrete. They are measurable. They are discussable. But foundational physiology is quieter. It requires routine, it requires consistency, and it requires repetition over months and years. Mechanical tension applied consistently, deep sleep protected intentionally, metabolic health supported through whole food patterns rather than narrow macronutrient obsession, hormonal systems preserved by avoiding chronic overtraining and under-recovery. When those are all present, protein becomes what it was always meant to be, a supporting actor. The first question is not how much. The first question is what comes first. If we are early in our health journey, focus on lifting with intention and sleeping with discipline. If we are later in our health journey, focus on maintaining mechanical stimulus and protecting recovery capacity. If we are somewhere in between, resist the temptation to add complexity before we have mastered consistency. Muscle is not built by numbers on a nutrition app. It is built by stress, recovery, and time. Protein matters, it just doesn't matter first. This is Uncommonly Remarkable. Thanks for listening.